There have been some major developments in the Sean Combs criminal case, including that federal authorities may be traveling to the UK to find more alleged victims. We're going to break it down for you right now. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Well, it's officially been 2 weeks since Sean Diddy Combs was arrested after a grand jury indicted him on federal charges out in New York. He's facing charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution. Essentially, that Combs allegedly engaged in a campaign of criminal activity, including sex trafficking and abusing women for years, that he was operating a criminal enterprise, and more specifically, that he would use drugs and violence and threats to force people to engage in these sexual performances called freak-offs, usually, or a lot of the times, with male sex workers, that he would film these encounters without people knowing. That's another allegation in the indictment and the letters from the government. And prosecutors say that they have interviewed over 50 witnesses and victims, and that they have obtained a wealth of electronic data that they say chronicles this alleged criminal activity, including videos of the freak-offs. And there have been some developments in this case that we want to get into, and I'm going to start with a major one right now. So as the rapper and media mogul sits in the Brooklyn Metropolitan Detention Center on these federal charges, it is being reported that federal prosecutors from the Southern District of New York, where this case is being prosecuted, are now traveling across the pond to London, that they are looking for more possible victims over there. The U.S. Sun reporting that a team of detectives have arrived in London, that they came last week, that this is based on allegations that Combs may have abused women in the UK. And after all, when you think about it, Combs has been in London regularly for years. If we attach it to the time frame that was laid out by prosecutors in their indictment, because they allege that he was abusing women since 2009, well, Combs, for example, back in 2010, was promoting his film Get Him to the Greek. In June of 2010, he launched Sean John in London. And at the time, he said, "I have always enjoyed traveling throughout Europe and spend much of my vacation time here, and London truly feels like a second home to me." Now, few things to note here about this report. One, how can this tie back to the current charges? Well, in the charges that he currently faces, there is an element of transporting people either across state lines or international lines for the purposes of forced or coerced commercial sex and prostitution. And for the racketeering charge, prosecutors explain how this criminal enterprise that he allegedly was the leader of engaged in activities that affected foreign commerce. So, in other words, if this abuse occurred abroad, if this is another pattern of abuse that maybe emanated in the United States and then went abroad and came back, or if there are witnesses to this abuse abroad, maybe American citizens were being abused abroad and then you have witnesses in the UK, or maybe Combs was transporting people from London back to the United States for criminal purposes, you could see how prosecutors would be interested in such evidence as a form of sex trafficking or transportation of people for the purposes of prostitution or a racketeering conspiracy. In fact, a source told the Mirror, quote, "Given the huge amount of time he spent in London, there are concerns that the alleged offending was not confined to America's shores. Prosecutors are imploring anyone in the UK who may have information they feel could help the investigation to get in touch." And this, by the way, is consistent with what a lot of us in the legal community have been saying, that we should expect the possibility of a superseding indictment in Combs' case. This is when you have additional information, you go back to the grand jury to get a new amended indictment, that he could be charged with additional crimes, that there could be more victims, perhaps even more defendants are named. Something very similar happened in the R. Kelly situation. He was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison for his own sex trafficking and racketeering charges. Remember, he was charged in a superseding indictment in New York federal court. By the way, the allegations, the lawsuits, the criminal case, that has had quite an effect on Sean Combs' businesses and his career, too. We actually dedicated previous sidebars to that. But thinking about that for a second and talking about that, I'm actually going to take a guess and say that a lot of you out there might be business owners yourselves, right? Maybe some of you even do sales of some sort. Well, if that's the case, I want to highlight one of our awesome sponsors, Odoo. So Odoo is great. Odoo is a free all-in-one business management software that provides you with a range of applications that helps with the day-to-day of owning a business. So for example, Odoo has this CRM app, and you can use it to seamlessly create quotations for sales orders that are then sent to clients. In a few clicks, it totally automates the process, makes it super simple. Look at these quotations, clean, professional. Also, this feature has an internal notes tool, helps keep track of every activity through the sales CRM process. It's clear, it's transparent for you and your team. So I want to thank you to Odoo for sponsoring Sidebar and also giving us access to their platform. And right now you can click our link, odoo.com/LC Sidebar, and you can try Odoo for free right now. And by the way, there are other federal statutes that could potentially come into play if we're talking about London, we're talking about things that might have happened abroad, if we're talking about additional charges, especially if it has anything to do with minors. And to be clear, there are no allegations about minors by prosecutors. There have been allegations about minors in the civil lawsuits, but if prosecutors want to bring charges regarding the abuse of minors, if we take that as an assumption for now, if we put that on the table, under federal law, there is a charge with respect to enticing minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, abuse in another country. That can tie back to that. That's what happened with Ghislaine Maxwell, the woman who was convicted of federal sexual abuse of minors charges in New York and sentenced to 20 years in prison, Jeffrey Epstein's madam. That's what Maxwell was convicted of. In her case, prosecutors say she encouraged a minor to give Epstein massages in London. Now, to be clear, back to Combs, again, this is speculation at this point when it comes to minors. He has not been charged with respect to that. But again, if we're thinking of ways prosecutors could potentially charge him for conduct abroad, this is why I'm bringing up federal statutes like this. Okay, but there's another point to this development too. And it was echoed by Palm Beach County State Attorney Dave Arenberg last week when we had him here on Sidebar. It is important for prosecutors in New York to get Combs locked up on pretrial detention, to be denied bail, to be in the Metropolitan Detention Center. Why? So that more accusers could feel safe to come forward. In other words, Combs can't hurt you. He can't intimidate you. He can't call you, which, by the way, were the allegations laid out by prosecutors for why he should be denied bail. They claimed that he was contacting witnesses and victims, providing them false narratives as a way to silence them. So with him being locked up, more people, whether in the United States or abroad, may feel safe to come forward. That has to be something on prosecutors' mind if you take these allegations against Combs as true. In fact, that's why it's perhaps not surprising that we saw another lawsuit after Combs was arrested and denied bail. Talia Graves, talk about another major development. She filed a lawsuit in New York federal court accusing Combs and his bodyguard, Joseph Sherman, of drugging and sexually assaulting her back in 2001 and filming this encounter too. She claims that after being offered a glass of wine and feeling lightheaded and dizzy and physically weak, she lost consciousness, wakes up naked. She's in a Manhattan recording studio tied up where she alleges Combs and Sherman assaulted her both sexually and physically. Sherman, by the way, denied the allegations, calling them in a statement, quote, false and baseless, and that this was a, quote, clear attempt at a money grab. Now, I should tell you as well, one other reason why United States federal authorities may be in London as well, assuming these reports are true, by the way, is perhaps they are working with UK prosecutors to build a case over there. Not outside the realm of possibility that UK prosecutors may be planning to bring a case against Combs there too. But again, speculation, we do not know for sure. But talking about what other additional charges Combs could face or what's happening behind the scenes, another big development is when an attorney for a new Combs accuser claimed that she had been contacted regarding the sale of one of the Diddy tapes, referring to sex tapes. I'm talking about attorney Ariel Mitchell-Kidd, who appeared on Banfield on News Nation. She claimed, without naming names, that the person on this alleged sex tape that was being distributed or trying to be distributed was someone, quote, more high profile. She said, quote, "There already have been tapes leaking around Hollywood being shopped around, but one particular person contacted me to shop a particular video. I can tell the video was pornographic. This was in his Atlanta home, and it does seem like the person isn't looking into the video. To me, it doesn't seem like that person knows they're being videotaped." Now, assuming this is true, because this is simply an allegation, but assuming this is true, aside from the fact that distributing and selling content like this is itself potentially a crime, linking this back to the current charges that Combs faces, prosecutors, remember, they allege that Combs would film people having sex with commercial sex workers during these freak-offs without their knowledge. Going back to the government's letter regarding bail, they state, quote, "The evidence against the defendant, which would be made public at trial, includes substantial evidence that is highly sensitive and has the potential to significantly and negatively impact the defendant's reputation. For example, dozens of video recordings created by the defendant of freak-offs with victims." Now, Mitchell Kidd also explained that one of her new clients was raped back in 2018, which, by the way, is within that time frame listed by prosecutors of when this sex trafficking and racketeering and abuse happened. So she says that this unnamed client alleges that when she was at a friend's house, this is somebody in the industry, Sean Combs came over and she started to feel woozy after taking a drink, and then Combs allegedly sexually assaulted her and then directed another man to sexually assault her while Combs watched and touched himself, consistent with the theme of the freak-offs from the indictment. By the way, Combs has denied the allegations here. In fact, his attorney, Mark Anafilo, said he is an imperfect person, but he is not a criminal, and he asked everybody to reserve judgment. All indications, by the way, are Combs plans to fight these charges. Mr. Agnifilo indicating that Combs has no plans to take a deal in this case. That's one of the latest developments, too, which I must tell you is not entirely surprising, because if you read this indictment, prosecutors are essentially saying that Combs is at the top of this criminal enterprise, that he's the boss, that he was directing this criminal conspiracy, and that he had all these people working under him to facilitate this criminal activity. So it doesn't seem likely to me that he would be offered a deal by federal prosecutors that wouldn't include significant prison time. I mean, think about what they're alleging here. Currently, he's facing 15 years to life in prison. After the allegations in the indictment and the strong words from United States Attorney Damian Williams during his press conference after the announcement of the arrest and indictment, how can they offer Combs a light deal? Does it make sense? Listen to this.
A year ago, Sean Combs stood in Times Square and was handed a key to New York City. Today, he's been indicted and will face justice in the Southern District of New York. As alleged, Combs used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sexual performances with male commercial sex workers, some of whom he transported or caused to be transported over state lines. Combs allegedly planned and controlled the sex performances, which he called freak-offs, and he often electronically recorded them. The freak-offs sometimes lasted days at a time, involved multiple commercial sex workers, and often involved a variety of narcotics, such as ketamine, ecstasy, and GHB, which Combs distributed to the victims to keep them obedient and compliant. As alleged, when Combs didn't get his way, he was violent, and he subjected victims to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse so that they would participate in the freak-offs, and that Combs hit, kicked, threw objects at, and dragged victims, at times by their hair.
So again, I don't think he would be offered a deal that wouldn't include significant prison time, maybe 10 years in prison, even if, as people have been saying online, that he's going to name names and come out and mention high-profile people. I don't know if they even need him for that. If they have a lot of corroborating witnesses and they have electronic data, what more could he provide? But B, even if he were to spill the beans about people, he wouldn't get off the hook. So I'm not surprised that he's saying, or his attorney is saying, he's not going to agree to a deal right now. And for Combs, also, he probably doesn't want to agree to any prison time. First, he may legitimately believe he can beat this case, and there are a number of defenses he can raise with the current charges. He could say there's no conspiracy, There was no actual agreement with anyone to form a criminal enterprise. Talking racketeering, he could say there's no criminal organization, there was no common scheme, there was no common purpose, that the prosecution's alleging a number of isolated incidents. They're trying to umbrella them all together into one thing. Doesn't make sense. Sex trafficking of victim one, whoever this person may be, he can argue there was no fraud, there was no coercion, there was no force used. These weren't illegal commercial sex acts. For instance, if victim one is Cassandra Ventura, Combs' ex-girlfriend who filed the initial lawsuit against him back in November of 2023, and there's an argument to be made that she is victim one in this indictment, could he not say, hey, she was my girlfriend. Yeah, I flew her around. Yeah, we were intimate. Yes, we engaged in freak-offs, but she agreed. Everything was consensual. There was no sex workers. There was no illicit drug use. I wasn't sex trafficking. I wasn't forcing her to engage in these sex acts with male sex workers. Yeah, there were freak-offs. Yeah, I called them freak-offs, but everyone agreed to it. It was consensual. No one felt threatened. No one was harmed. He can make those defenses. We'll see if he can. Again, just a sampling of what a defense could be and what Combs may feel he can win on. He may feel he can win this case, so why take a plea deal? And another reason he may not want to take a plea deal is because, again, prison is certainly not a place he wants to be at all. While there were conflicting reports about his time so far in federal lockup at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, it's our understanding that at one point he had been subjected to intense monitoring for his safety. Although, according to latest reports, he's been visited by his family. Lawyer for Combs told people he's very focused, he's very strong, he's concentrating on his defense, he's preparing for his trial. And I've said this before, in the months leading up to his arrest, when he surrendered his passport to lawyers, they were in constant communication with prosecutors from the Southern District of New York about what he was doing, what his travel plans were. When he came to New York to voluntarily surrender, it seems to me he legitimately believed he could make bail. I don't think he anticipated being locked up. He probably thought, I'll be on home confinement for a year, 2 years as I await trial. Reports indicate he was in shock when he was denied bail, especially since he offered an attractive bail package. It included a $50 million bond secured by a property, providing the court with visitor logs, having his phone and internet use taken away, having a third-party security team monitor him. But two different judges were not persuaded, given the gravity of the charges, the weight of the evidence, and moreover, the allegations that he had been contacting witnesses and victims. I don't think he was anticipating being in lockup, and I don't think it's a place that he was preparing on being. Now, I want to mention this too in another development. One of the latest people to comment on Sean Combs' situation is Shark Tank star and investor Mark Cuban. On the latest episode of Theo Von's This Past Weekend podcast, Cuban, who was the guest, said, I'm sure glad that I didn't hang out with him, meaning Sean Combs. He went on to say, actually, back in 2003, he reached out to me, to the Mavs, and wanted to design a uniform for us, and I never met him. We did it all via email, and so he had some of his designers get in touch with me, and they put together some, and it was a cool-looking uniform, right? Cuban said, we used it for a couple of years, but that was the extent of my connection to Diddy, and then he claimed that Combs' parties really weren't his scene. And what's interesting about this is how silent a number of high-profile celebrities have been, not only in the wake of Combs' arrest and indictment, but also in the wake of all those civil lawsuits and the raids on his properties. This was happening for a while. And there are a number of reasons why celebrities and high-profile people haven't spoken out. Maybe they're talking with investigators. Maybe they plan to. Maybe they're cooperating witnesses and will testify at trial. Maybe they're part of the case. Have they provided evidence? Or on the other hand, do they just simply not want to be talking about anything related to Sean Combs from a PR and career point of view? But to have Mark Cuban come out and say, I have no connection to Sean Combs, that's something we really haven't heard too much of lately. So those are some of the latest developments in the case. Stay with us here on Sidebar as we plan to continue to follow more for you as new details come out. All right, that's all we have for you right now. Everybody, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.